I want to welcome you all back to episode 2 of the African American Student Studies Association. Thank you for joining us for this documentary series, and today is a really insightful one. We're going to talk about one of the major cultural revolutions in American history. You may have heard of it. It's called the Harlem Renaissance. To give you a little background on the Harlem Renaissance, it is really an outpouring of the hearts of Southern African Americans as they migrated in droves to the north, from places such as Jacksonville, Florida, Yulee, Florida, Valdosta, Georgia, Brunswick, Georgia, Charleston, South Carolina, Columbia, South Carolina, Charlotte, North Carolina, Lumberton, North Carolina, Virginia, parts of Maryland. In droves, African Americans, at the rise of Jim Crow, went to the north for more opportunity. What kind of opportunity, some people ask? Work. What drives most people to leave home and go elsewhere? Economic improvement. Harlem became the bedrock. It became the cradle of civilization, if you will, for Black people during the early 20th century. Initially not an African American community at all, Harlem became an overwhelmingly African American community when African Americans were displaced from what we now call Central Park, New York. And so when you combine the displaced African New Yorkers with the droves of African Americans leaving the South, and I'll be honest, some fleeing the South, you end up with a confluence of people and a culture and a sound that can only happen really when you have a combination of people moving in droves for opportunity. They bring with them their pain, their hopes, their children, their food, their songs, their poetry themselves. That, in a nutshell, is how the Harlem Renaissance was born. It was born out of the souls of Black folks who wanted something more out of this American dream. And so today we're going to really examine the Harlem Renaissance and just highlight some of the cool aspects of the Renaissance. And it truly was the Renaissance. Sometimes I wish it wasn't called the Harlem Renaissance because it really was an American Renaissance. But it really fueled music and entertainment in the United States even to today. So I'm glad you all are here today. Angel, welcome.
Hello.
Vishnu, welcome.
Hello.
Thank you for joining the African American Studies Student Association, episode 3.
Of course.
We're talking about the Harlem Renaissance. And in particular, we're going to talk about what really fueled the economic opportunity, which was World War I.
Okay.
When World War I struck, Americans fled to fight. In particular, the men went to fight,
Right.
leaving a lot of jobs in cities, especially cities like New York. And so as we talked about earlier about African Americans coming in droves to the north for economic opportunity, what really fueled that was the war. Now, when they came, housing was an issue, of course. Seeking affordable rent was an issue. There was a lot of people who took advantage of them, but all in all, they persevered. So when we think about the Harlem Renaissance, the first person I think of is W.E.B. Du Bois. He was one of the leading activists. He was the first African American to graduate from Harvard University with a doctoral degree. He was a leading activist and one of the founders of the NAACP, which is the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. And so people like W.E.B. Du Bois really put a lot of shape around what life in the North for Negroes would be like. And then there's Marcus Garvey. Now, have you ever heard of Marcus?
No, sir.
I have not.
Oh, Marcus Garvey was a Jamaican man that came from the Caribbean.
Nice.
And he was known for, his mantra was, "Rise up, you mighty people, accomplish what you will."
Beautiful.
And he was very encouraging for African Americans, but he believed that African Americans would never be able to achieve much in the United States and that we needed to return to Africa.
Okay.
So he was the founder of the Back to Africa movement.
I see.
And so he kind of went off the scene after a while, and then the cultural revolution just emerged. Like it just began to flourish.
Right.
So let's talk about some authors.
For sure.
Let's talk about some authors of the Harlem Renaissance. Throw one out at us, Angel.
Langston Hughes.
Oh, tell us about Langston.
So Langston Hughes was an American poet. He was a social activist, novelist, playwright, columnist, and he was from Missouri. He was one of the earliest innovators for an art form known as jazz poetry, and he's best known as one of the leaders in the Harlem Renaissance.
That jazz poetry is now what we call slam poetry.
Wow.
Isn't that amazing? Yeah. It adapted and it morphed into slam poetry. So another great thing from the Harlem Renaissance, still alive today. I tell you, Langston's got a university named after him.
Oh, really?
Really?
Absolutely.
Oh, man.
It's in Oklahoma.
Are you serious?
Yes.
That's pretty cool.
It is the HBCU, the Historically Black College University that's in Oklahoma.
Wow.
I know a few people that have gone there. They loved it.
Awesome.
Do you have another author you'd like to talk about? Or one you're curious about?
Zora Neale Hurston. Can you tell us about that?
Zora's one of my favorites. Their Eyes Were Watching God. That was her seminal novel. That is the novel that gave her the name she has today. She wrote several novels. She actually comes from southern Florida. Her family had been slaves in Florida. But she was actually born in Notasulga, Alabama, which is right down the street from where I went to college in Tuskegee, Alabama.
Oh, look at that.
Yeah, so Macon County, Alabama was the most African-American populated county in the state of Alabama, which is why Booker T. Washington was asked to come there to found a college.
Oh, okay.
But Zora was a revolutionary. She went to college in New York. She went to Barnett in New York. She was an anthropologist by trade. And if you can just kind of wrap your mind around that, getting a degree in anthropology prior to 1920.
Huge.
It is. I think it's crazy. It's let you know you can do whatever you want. You know, if you put your mind to it, you can do it.
Definitely.
And then she went down to the South. She returned to the South to do anthropological work, looking at the conditions of African Americans on what we now call orange farms, which were formerly just orange plantations.
Oh, okay.
And she ended up writing an analysis, an anthropological analysis, that's a mouthful, that turned into Their Eyes Were Watching God. So her novelesque ability was a derivative of her anthropological work. Love Zora. You know she didn't like Langston, though. It's interesting that when people think you have a singular race, you have a singular mind.
Yeah.
But I want to remind people that movements don't move forward. Change doesn't happen because everyone agrees. Change actually happens because people disagree. And it is in that conflict that progress can actually be made.
Yeah, very true.
Because if there's no conflict and no disagreement, that's not called progress, that's called dictatorship.
Yeah.
Right? So
Yeah.
Zora and Langston, enemies.
Oh my goodness.
Did not like each other at all, and W.E.B. Du Bois thought they were all silly. So, you know, it just goes like that. What do you think of that?
I mean, I think that's a really good point you make about how, like, you have to have disagreement to have that progress because, like you said, it's kind of a dictatorship. If everyone feels the same way, everyone's going to push for that exact same thing. There's not going to be any change and things are going to be stuck. But it's cool that those two, even though they kind of had the same cause that they were pushing for, they both disagreed, but at the end, they kind of had that same outcome that benefited everybody, which I really like.
Yep.
How about you, Vishnu?
100% couldn't agree with Angel more. I think took the words out of my mouth. She said it the best.
All right.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So, how about we talk about some poets?
For sure.
I like the poets. I really like the poets. James Weldon Johnson wrote a poem that became the Negro National Anthem.
Oh.
Lift every voice and sing. And when I was a kid growing up, we sung that every Sunday in church in the month of February.
Wow.
All four verses. It was long, but we sang it by memory.
Yeah. Beautiful.
But what do you think a song like that does, or what does poetry do for a people?
I want to say, like, from when I read poetry, I'm not a very poetic person, but like when I read poetry in like English, I think it's really cool because that's the way people like express how they're feeling, whether it's like anger, sadness, and I think especially for people during this time, they couldn't really do that vocally, so they used the arts such as like theater, music, and poetry to do that, and they got that message across to multiple people and audiences. Yeah.
That's amazing. How about you, Vishnu?
I feel like with poetry, it really just brings everybody together. and a nice, strong, independent community, right? With my tradition, we have like pujas and we have rhymes and stuff like that, which really brings the entire community together. We all pray as one, we all diverse as one. So I feel like going back to the African American culture here with this poetry, I feel like it just really brought them together and like as a big, like one big family.
Wow.
Yeah.
I couldn't have said it better.
Thank you.
Because it was the poetry that united the community,
Yes.
even though the community was incredibly diverse.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Even though they were all of one race, they were of varying beliefs, varying thoughts, ideas. And it was actually the poets of the Harlem Renaissance, people such as James Weldon Johnson, Claude McKay, who was actually a Jamaican man, that actually, I call it congealed or glued the community together.
Yes.
It was the poets. And of course, you all know poets give us the social critique.
Yes, sir.
Yes.
That's
Yes,
why
sir.
they're loved and hated all the same.
Yes.
That's why that
Very
happens.
true.
Let's move to music. I'm a musician, so you know.
Of course.
Look like you're chopping at the bit. Talk to us.
Louis Armstrong, I think that's someone like people know just by name.
Yeah.
I'm not super familiar with him, but I do know like he was very boomed out in the Harlem Renaissance in
Yes.
the 1920s, and he was familiar in the jazz area.
Yeah.
He performed at speakeasies, right? Which were they not illegal at that time?
Oh, of course they were illegal. Of course they were illegal. Yeah. Because what's going on also at this time? Prohibition.
Right.
Right. So you're absolutely right. Go ahead.
But I think it's cool that he was like, he boomed in that era because like we said, like the arts kind of thing, it's a way that people can unite, especially during a time where even though it was a similar group, they had different like ideals and stuff.
Yes.
And during that time, like even though like it was legal, like at speakeasies they were able to come together and they were able to just have fun, I feel, which is something that can unite them to push for something they want.
I love that you say speakeasies because the birthplace of jazz is not New York. The birthplace of jazz is actually New Orleans and along the Mississippi Delta. But the beauty is that Louis brought that sound to New York.
Oh.
And at first, your Northern Negroes were not accepting of it.
Right. Right.
Because Northern African Americans and Southern African Americans were very different. But after a while, that music is music.
Yeah.
You know, after a while, a good beat and a good rhyme,
Yes.
Yes.
everybody starts tapping their feet. And before you know it, music, again, like poetry,
Yeah.
brings everyone together and clubs are born.
Yes.
Some of the most popular clubs in the world are in Harlem.
Beautiful.
You know one?
Yes, sir.
You know the name of one?
I don't know any, but to be honest, but
Okay.
yeah.
That's all right.
Yeah.
Angel, you know the name of one of those popular clubs?
Ooh, I don't know.
Come on, what did many slaves pick in the South?
Cotton. Oh, the Cotton Club.
The Cotton Club. The Cotton Club was one of the most prominent clubs. If you could book a gig in the Cotton Club, Vishnu, you made it.
Oh.
You made it. And anybody who was somebody did the Cotton Club. They got a gig in the Cotton Club. Louis standing ovation every time he was there.
course.
But there's some other people. You ever heard of a lady named Bessie Smith?
Bessie Smith.
I have. Yes.
Because not only did jazz come, blues came.
Oh.
And the
okay.
blues
Yeah.
are the sounds of the pains of African Americans in the South.
Yes.
And their travails as they come north.
Correct.
And they brought that in their music. So the blues are aligned with Negro spirituals. Musically, but the message is far not too spiritual. But the message is there. It's life. It's experience. Bessie Smith catapulted during the Harlem Renaissance. Moms Mabley, a comedian, catapulted during the Harlem Renaissance. Ma Rainey. There's a series right now on Netflix called Ma Rainey's Black Bottom. That's all about singing the blues.
Oh, wow.
It's all about the blues. All of them performed at the Cotton Club or at the Savoy, where you can find Cab Calloway. Who else do you like to talk about from the Harlem Renaissance in terms of our musicians and singers?
Did we touch on Bill Bojangles Robinson?
You tell us about it.
I don't know. Why not Vishnu? Vishnu, do you want to touch on
Okay, yeah, for sure. So here it says, his long career mirrored changes in American entertainment taste and technology. He started in the age of minstrel shows and moved to vaudeville, Broadway, the recording industry, Hollywood, radio, and television.
Yeah, that vaudeville.
Yeah.
That was a big circuit. vaudeville was a circuit, and many people would travel with that circuit to make money. Ma Rainey was on vaudeville, and then she went on her own. And then Mr. Bojangles, when he got to Harlem, went on his own.
Yeah.
So those minstrel shows were controversial, let's say. But all of these musicians that you're talking about, these dancers, Josephine Baker, who left the country to go to France, and you may have just seen a couple weeks ago, she was inducted in France as one of their heroes now.
Wow,
Yes,
cool.
all out of the Harlem Renaissance. So, in your mind, how would you sum up the Harlem Renaissance? We'll start with Angel.
I want to say it was like kind of the rebirth of African American culture in the artistic kind of way. So for music, theaters, dancing, all types of things. I know we focus kind of on music right now, and poetry and just literature wise, but I think the Harlem Renaissance is extremely significant to our history because, like you said, it's prominent today. We see that in clubs, we see that in poetry, and it was a way for them to kind of express the struggles they may have personally experienced. But it definitely allowed them to like also express themselves to those who didn't understand what they were feeling, and I think it's also a reason why we're here, because without it, we may not even be sitting here today, you know.
That's true.
We may not have the literature we have today, you know. And I think that's really cool.
Wonderful. How about you, Vishnu? You've been hanging out with us today, and we're glad you decided to do this with us.
Of course, yeah, I'm more than glad to.
When you think of what we just discussed and other things that you may have read about the Harlem Renaissance, how would you sum it up?
I couldn't agree with Angel more, but not only does it bring out the poetry and the music from this African American culture, I feel like it also brings out the figures, the important public figures that are also being praised in different countries and states that have just made such a huge impact in not just this country, but the entire world, right?
Wow.
So I think
It's kind of like showing us even now that like we can use different forms to kind of speak and use our voice.
100%. Yeah.
And I wish we would use more forms.
Yes.
So I'm really, really glad that we got to have this discussion today about the Harlem Renaissance. While it was very light and jovial, in my opinion, the Harlem Renaissance is amazing.
Yeah.
Yes.
And beyond being the Harlem Renaissance, I really want to underscore that it's an American Renaissance. Not just African Americans were a part of this, but many white Americans. Jazz music is a creation of white and black Americans. So I think as we close this episode, I think it's important to remember that African American history, African American experience is American experience, is American history. And as you mentioned, Vishnu, the prominent figures, there are sons and daughters of the Harlem Renaissance that people may be more familiar with, like Thurgood Marshall. He was in the Harlem Renaissance. He was there. He was a friend of Langston Hughes. Martin Luther King was trained by Benjamin E. Mays, who is a Harlem Renaissance person. So, I mean, the sons and the daughters of the Harlem Renaissance continue to this day.
They bring the legacy with them.
They carry the legacy forward, and then now look at us all sitting here.
Yeah.
We're also sons and daughters of this Harlem American Renaissance. So I want to thank everybody for joining us today for episode 2 of the African American Studies Student Association's documentary. Episode 3 is coming up. You'll see that next week. And it is on science, technology, engineering, and math. How African Americans have contributed to those disciplines down through the years. Thank you for being with us, and we look forward to meeting with you again very soon. Have a good one. Bye-bye.